My father didn't even clear his throat before doing it. He just pushed a polished folder across the mahogany table and said my sister's name like it was a promise. Kelsey had been home for 7 days. I had carried my parents and this company for 10 years. My mother's nod was the loudest thing in the room. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just watched the legacy I built slide across the wood into the hands of a girl who thought a supply chain was something you wore around your neck. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out of the dining room without saying a word. I went straight to my office in the west wing of the estate, a room that smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. It was the nerve center of the Sterling Palate, the culinary empire my parents, Thomas and Christina, claimed to run. But they didn't run it. They posed for it. I sat down at my desk, the same desk where I had spent every Christmas Eve for the last decade auditing vendor contracts, and I pulled up Instagram. There it was. Kelsey's latest post. A selfie of her holding a white truffle the size of a golf ball, pouting for the camera. The caption read, "Sourcing the best for the new era. #BossBabe." I stared at the screen, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical detachment. Kelsey didn't source that truffle. I did. I sourced it at 4 a.m, 3 weeks ago, on a call with a supplier in Alba who was threatening to cut us off because my father had forgotten to sign the wire transfer authorization. I had negotiated the price down by 15%, arranged the refrigerated air freight, and cleared it through customs while Kelsey was presumably sleeping off a hangover in Ibiza. That was the dynamic. That had always been the dynamic. My parents were the face, the celebrity chefs with the bright smiles and the signature aprons. Kelsey was the shimmer, the influencer who made the brand look young and effortless. And I was the scaffolding. I was the ugly, invisible steel that held the building up so they could dance on the roof. For years, I told myself it was a partnership. I told myself that my sweat equity was buying me a future. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I solved enough crises, if I made them enough money, they would eventually see me. But looking at that folder in Kelsey's hands, I realized the truth. It wasn't that they didn't see me. It was that they looked right through me. There is a term for this, something I read once in a psychology journal at 3 a.m. when the anxiety wouldn't let me sleep. The glass child. It usually refers to the healthy sibling of a sick child, the one who is expected to be perfect and invisible so the parents can focus on the crisis. But in my family, the crisis wasn't an illness. It was an ego. Kelsey was the star, the fragile, charismatic center of their universe who needed constant adoration and funding. I was the glass. I was sturdy, transparent, and utterly taken for granted. My competence wasn't a virtue to Thomas and Christina. It was a convenience. It allowed them to ignore me. They didn't have to worry about Samantha. Samantha handled the taxes. Samantha handled the health inspectors. Samantha handled the debt restructuring when they overspent on the Aspen location. My utility had become my prison. I had made myself so useful that I had stripped myself of personhood. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was an appliance. You don't thank your refrigerator for keeping the milk cold. You only notice it when it breaks. And that was the mistake they made. They assumed the refrigerator would keep humming along, even after they unplugged it. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I didn't cry. I didn't throw a vase against the wall. I picked up a pen. This wasn't a heartbreak. It was a liquidation event. I started making a list. Not of what I was losing, but of what I was taking with me. The next morning, the air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of espresso and entitlement. My mother, Christina, was leaning against the marble island, flipping through a bridal magazine for Kelsey, even though Kelsey wasn't engaged. It was just another prop in the theater of their lives. When I walked in, she didn't look up. She just slid a thick binder toward me. "Good morning, Samantha," she said, her voice breezy, as if she hadn't gutted my career 12 hours prior. We have a proposition for you. A generous one. I stopped pouring my coffee. I'm listening. We know this transition is a big change, she said, finally glancing at me with a practiced smile. And we want to make sure you feel included. Kelsey is going to need support. She has the vision, obviously, but she hates the boring stuff. So, we're making you head of operations. I looked at the binder. Head of operations. It's a vital role, my father chimed in, walking in from the patio. You'll handle the schedules, the inventory, the payroll. You'll report directly to Kelsey. It keeps it in the family. Kelsey breezed in a moment later, wearing silk pajamas that cost more than my first car. She picked up a strawberry and bit into it without washing it. Yeah, Sam. Honestly, the brand is just so stale right now. It's too logistical. I need you to just handle the messy parts so I can focus on the vibe. We need to pivot. Pivot. The word hung in the air. She wanted to pivot away from the logistics that generated $12 million in revenue last year. She wanted me to be her secretary. She wanted me to continue being the spine while she wore the skin. And, my mother added, her voice dropping to that serious tone she used when she was asking for a favor she felt entitled to, we'll need you to prepare the handover binders. All the vendor contacts, the recipes, the login codes. Kelsey needs full access by the gala on Friday. This was the moment. This was the moment where the old Samantha, the daughter who craved a pat on the head, would have argued. I would have screamed that I wasn't a secretary, that I was the reason they weren't bankrupt. But that Samantha died at the dinner table last night. The woman standing in the kitchen was someone else entirely. Of course, I said. My voice was even, devoid of any jagged edges. I'll get everything in order. By Friday. Kelsey clapped her hands. Perfect. See? I told you she'd be chill about it. Thanks, Sam. I smiled. It was a small, tight thing that didn't reach my eyes. Don't mention it. I took the binder and walked out. I didn't go to my office. I went to my car. I drove 40 minutes into the city, parking in the underground garage of a glass and steel tower that housed the firm of Sterling, Cooper, and Hines. Mr. Sterling had been the corporate attorney for the family business since its inception. He was a man who respected two things, billable hours and competence. He had always liked me. When I sat down in his office, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need to review the intellectual property assignment clause in my employment contract. The one from 5 years ago. Mr. Sterling raised an eyebrow, adjusting his glasses. The amendment your parents signed when you restructured the supply chain? That's the one. He pulled the file. He knew exactly what was in it. 5 years ago, the business was bleeding cash. I had developed a series of proprietary spice blends and sauces that could be mass-produced and sold in grocery stores. It saved the company. At the time, I demanded a clause that assigned the rights to those specific creations to me, personally, as the creator, licensing them back to the company for a fee. My parents, desperate for the cash flow and bored by legal jargon, had signed it without reading. They thought they were signing a tax form. It says here, Mr. Sterling read, his voice dry, that all proprietary recipes, vendor exclusivity contracts negotiated by the employee, and trademarks associated with the pantry line to remain the sole property of Samantha Hart, revocable with 48 hours notice. And the vendor contracts? I asked. The ones with the truffle suppliers in Italy, the Wagyu farms in Japan? Signed by you, personally. Guaranteed by your personal assets, not the LLC. You did that to get better credit terms when the company's rating was trash. I nodded. I want to execute the revocation. I want to transfer all rights, all recipes, and all vendor agreements to a new holding company under my name alone. Effective Friday at midnight. Mr. Sterling looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He didn't look horrified. He looked impressed. You know what this does to them, Samantha? Without the pantry line revenue and the exclusive supplier contracts, the Sterling Palate is just a collection of expensive leases and overhead. I know, I said. They wanted the brand. They can have the brand. I'm taking the business. It's legal, he said, closing the file. It's ruthless, but it's legal. They signed it. Do you want me to draft the notices? Yes. Have them ready for the gala. I walked out of that office and felt the strangest sensation. I felt light. For 10 years, I had been carrying the weight of their incompetence, shielding them from the consequences of their own laziness. I had been the invisible engine keeping the ship moving while they posed on the deck. I wasn't stealing the company. I was simply packing up my things and leaving. It just so happened that my things were the engine. The night of the Golden Gala was an exercise in excess. My parents had rented the ballroom of the most expensive hotel in the city. There were ice sculptures, a champagne fountain, and a red carpet for the local press. It cost more than the annual operations budget for 2 of our locations. I stood in the back, wearing a simple black dress, holding a single red folder. I watched my parents work the room. They were glowing, feeding off the camera flashes like vampires feeding on blood. Kelsey was on stage, wearing a gold sequined gown, holding a microphone. She looked radiant. She looked like a CEO, if your idea of a CEO came from a television show. We are entering a new era, Kelsey announced, her voice amplified across the room. An era of style, of taste, of modernity. We are saying goodbye to the old, dusty ways of doing things. The crowd cheered. My mother wiped a tear from her eye. My father raised a glass. They were celebrating their own reflection. I looked around the room. I saw the vendors I had known for years, the farmers, the distributors, the logistics managers. They weren't cheering. They were looking at their phones, looking at each other, looking nervous. They knew what I knew. They knew that glitter doesn't pay invoices. I waited until the speeches were over. I waited until the toast. Then, I walked up to the stage. I didn't grab the microphone. I didn't cause a scene. I simply walked up to Kelsey, who looked annoyed that I was interrupting her moment. Samantha, she hissed, away from the mic, what are you doing? You're ruining the shot. I'm just giving you what you asked for, I said, my voice calm enough to cut glass. I placed the red folder in her hands. Then, I reached into my purse and pulled out a heavy set of keys, the master keys to the physical locations, the warehouses, the offices. I placed them on top of the folder. It's all yours, I said. Mr. Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings. He was wearing his courtroom suit. He took the microphone that Kelsey was holding loosely in her shock. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice booming. If I could have your attention. A clarification on the transition of power tonight. The room went silent. My parents froze, their smiles wavering. Miss Kelsey is indeed inheriting the physical locations of the Sterling Palate, Mr. Sterling continued. However, pursuant to pre-existing contracts signed by the founders, the intellectual capital, including the proprietary recipes, the pantry line of products, and the exclusive supply chain agreements, are the sole property of Samantha Hart. As of midnight tonight, those assets have been withdrawn from the company. He looked at the crowd, specifically at the investors. To put it simply, Mr. Sterling said, invoking a philosophy he knew I loved. You have the ship. It's a beautiful ship. But the engine, the rudder, and the navigation charts have been removed. What remains is wood and water. My father surged forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. What is this? You can't do this. We'll sue you. You can try, I said, speaking for the first time to the room. But you signed the papers, Dad. 5 years ago. You didn't read them because you were too busy planning your sabbatical in Tuscany. You wanted the credit for the sauce, but you didn't want to make it. So you signed it over to me. This is theft, my mother screamed, abandoning her poise. You're stealing our company. I'm not stealing anything, I said. I'm taking what I built. You have the buildings. You have the tables. You have the logo. But you don't have the product. And you don't have the supply chain. Then, I dropped the second shoe. The one they didn't see coming. Oh, I said, pausing as I turned to leave. And there's one more thing. The name. The name? Kelsey whispered, clutching the red folder like a shield. The Sterling Palate, I said. Dad, do you remember the bankruptcy scare 5 years ago? The one you ignored because you said it was negative energy? He stared at me, his eyes widening. The LLC was insolvent, I explained, my voice echoing in the silent ballroom. The creditors were coming for the assets, including the trademark. I bought the trademark personally, with my own savings, to shield it from the seizure. I licensed it back to the company for $1 a year. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. I am terminating that license. You have buildings. You have debt. But you cannot operate under the name the Sterling Palate. You are essentially a ghost kitchen. The realization hit them like a physical wave. Without the recipes, they had no product. Without the vendors, they had no inventory. And without the name, they had no brand equity. They had inherited a shell. A hollow, expensive shell with $4.5 million in lease obligations and zero revenue capability. My phone started buzzing in my clutch. I checked it. It was the alerts I had set up. The emails were going out to the vendors automatically. Cancellation of contract. Change of billing address. Kelsey looked at the keys in her hand. But the loans. The leases. They're in the company name. Yes, I said. And as the CEO, they are now your problem. My mother grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, desperate. Samantha, fix this. Fix it right now. You're the fixer. That's what you do. I looked at her hand on my arm. For the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for her. No guilt. No longing. Just pity. I can't fix what I no longer touch, I said. I pulled my arm away and walked down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me. I didn't look back. I walked out of the ballroom, past the ice sculpture that was already starting to melt, dripping water onto the expensive red carpet. I didn't go home. I drove to a small commercial space I had rented quietly 3 months ago on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a palace. It was a test kitchen. The walls were painted a soft, calming cream. The morning sun was just starting to bleed through the high windows, illuminating the stainless steel counters. It was quiet here. No phones ringing. No demands. No parents taking credit for spices they couldn't name. I made a pot of coffee. The smell filled the small room, rich and grounding. I sat on a stool and watched the city wake up through the window. My phone was on the counter, face down. I knew it was exploding. I knew my parents were screaming into voicemails. I knew Kelsey was probably hyperventilating in the bathroom of the hotel. But I also knew this, I had felt guilty for years. I had felt guilty for wanting to leave, guilty for wanting credit, guilty for not being enough. And in that moment, sitting in the quiet, I realized something profound. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. You cannot save people who are determined to drown, especially if they are using you as the anchor. Cutting the rope isn't murder, it's self-preservation. I had spent my life trying to buy their love with my competence. I thought if I built them a big enough empire, they would finally give me a room in it. But they just wanted the keys. They never wanted the builder. I stood up and walked to the prep station. I had friends coming over later. Real friends. People who knew how I took my coffee, people who asked about my day and listened to the answer. I was going to cook for them. Not a product line. Just a meal. Roast chicken, root vegetables, simple bread. Food that nourished, not food that sold. I picked up a knife and an onion. The rhythmic chop against the cutting board was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of starting over. It was the sound of a life that finally, completely, belonged to me. If you have ever been the one holding up the sky for people who wouldn't even look up to see the weight on your shoulders, if you have ever had to walk away to save yourself, share this story. You are not alone. And the view from the other side is beautiful.